It's Sunday, 11th August 2024. Welcome to Nation Watch. As we move closer and closer to elections, whenever they are called, and we anticipate that they will be called by December, early December 2024, we expect the announcement to be made in September, and we are ready. Today we'll be discussing the question of reparation and the economic state of well-being of the African Guyanese. But before we get into that, on Friday 9th August, the world observed International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples under the theme, Protecting the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Voluntary Isolation and Initial Contact. The People's National Congress reform reasserts and reaffirms its commitment to defending the rights of Indigenous peoples and all Guyanese. Indigenous people living in isolation, voluntary isolation that is, and initial contact, hold human rights in a very unique situation of vulnerability. This is a group that cannot advocate for their own rights. This is a group that requires all state actors to take cognizance of their situation and to respect their decision to live in voluntary isolation. But given the international demand for, among other things, natural resources, for example, in our own country, the exploitation of natural resources brings a whole different set of factors to the table when it comes to Indigenous peoples, even those living in villages, in society. And therefore, it tells us that the vulnerability of our sisters and brothers living across the world in voluntary isolation are in danger. We either represent them, we either speak up for their rights, or we watch their population diminish to near zero. So this is our responsibility as a people, and governments of the world need to come to the realization that not all peoples of the world are excited by the prospects of being involved in general societal activities and life. We know what colonization brought to the Indigenous peoples of this region. We know what industrialization brought to this part of the region, this part of the world. We know that the Panama Canal brought with it malaria. We know that missionaries brought with them diseases to which our Indigenous peoples in this part of the world had absolutely no chance of survival given their immune system in relation to the diseases that were brought. And those are some of the risks associated with the whole question of forced contact. Many see the right to self-determination as the basis for respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples the world over living in voluntary isolation. But there's also the human rights associated with the right to live, the right to life, that is, and the right to health. The PNCR therefore joins with Indigenous peoples the world over in recognizing the importance of respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples and all citizens of the world. I'm joined today by a gentleman who needs absolutely no introduction. And so I present to you Dr. David Hinds, who is joining me today on Nation Watch for the very first time. Welcome, Dr. Hinds.
Thank you very much, Marvin. And one gets around on these programs, and as you were introducing the program, it occurred to me that this is my first appearance here.
Yeah.
I know way back somebody had invited me, but I couldn't make it. But I'm glad to be here. I'm extremely glad to be here. And I would like to lend my voice and lend the voice of my party, the Working People's Alliance, to the sentiments you expressed about our Indigenous peoples. You know, it is so unfortunate that in our Guyana, there are two tendencies that tend to isolate the indigenous people. One is the tendency of this overarching nationalism that diminishes individual ethnicities. And so we talk about this Guyanese nationalism that smothers indigenous peoples' nationalism, Indian nationalism, African nationalism, etc. And then the other thing is this overarching conflict between Africans and Indians, geographically on the coastland, that smothers and eliminates every other conversation. And so Amerindians are, indigenous people are left out of the conversation at two levels. And it is so unfortunate because the rest of us came after. The indigenous people are precisely that. They were here before. And so therefore, I hope that in the not so distant future, that we would be able to organize our political praxis in such a way that each individual group in the society finds an expressive place in there. And I think the place to begin that is not so much in the national discourse, but in the education system. I think that is where the whole notion of ethnic and cultural self-determination must begin. That an African child must be conscious of his or her own history, but be equally conscious of the history and the culture of indigenous peoples, Portuguese, East Indians, Chinese, and Europeans, who we tend to leave out because they're not so many. But I mean, the role that the Europeans have played make them central to our discourse. So I would like to echo your sentiments and to say to our indigenous brothers and sisters, not too long from now, hopefully we will be able to see you as equal citizens. And I say that without any fear of contradiction. We don't treat them as equal citizens. We don't.
That's a subject for next week's conversation.
Yes.
And that will be immediately before the commencement of the National Tushaus Council. We're going to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Today, we're talking about reparation and the economic well-being of the African Guyanese. And Dr. Hinds, you are an expert in this particular area, among others. Well, before I get there, permit me, sort of, on behalf of the leader of the People's National Congress Reform, the executive and general members, congratulate you on your most recent appointment as the Working People's Alliance presidential candidate for the next regional and general elections in Ghana. Congratulations to you.
Thank you so much.
It means that the opposition is ready for whatever is to come. African Guyanese, over the last 3 decades perhaps, have been, there appears to be a deliberate disempowerment agenda from the People's Progressive Party particularly. But if we go back in history, we find that this was a colonial, institutionalized kind of operation where freed Africans bought estates, bought lands, and pooled their resources, buying lands and developing farms and selling to these estates where they once worked food. And then the indentured laborers were given plots of land to sort of disempower the African community economically because there was less to sell. But when they persisted, their farmlands were flooded, rendering them powerless in every sense of the word. And this continued, and so over time, the African Guyanese, the free African, gravitated towards employment arrangements. But Guyana, in its movement towards independence, saw some change with the institutionalization of the village movement, with carefully crafted leadership structures, with an African Guyanese emerging as premiere in 1964, Forbes Burnham, and the whole set of activities following independence with nationalization and the broadening of the public service, African Guyanese were absorbed in that area of employment. And so there was no heavy emphasis on business or commerce, trade, because of these experiences, I rather suspect. How have these experiences affected the African Guyanese over the years? And how does it impact the lives of the African Guyanese today?
Yeah. I'm so glad for that overview, because the experience has been one of twists and turns. Immediately after emancipation, the African Guyanese created what some call a minor miracle. Some of us call it a major miracle. And that is, they set about and succeeded in humanizing this space, this coast that they used to call the White Coast. The coast, the African Guyanese, in a sense, tamed this coast, right? A place where they bought people, sold people, and killed people before they were 25 years old.
Yeah.
A place that was infected with all kinds of wild animals, infested with diseases. You mentioned European-brought diseases and all other things. And African Guyanese, with their own hands and their minds, were able to physically transform this place into a habitable environment. And then after emancipation, transform it into an habitable social environment with the creation of villages. Now, before they set up villages, they bought lands.
Yes.
That's very important. They bought land, so there was an entrepreneurial spirit there. But that entrepreneurial spirit was not in the traditional capitalist thing. They weren't being entrepreneurs for profits. They were being entrepreneurs for the building of a social environment, a collective social environment. And so when people say, for example, that African Guyanese are not business people, what they mean is that African Guyanese may not be business people in the traditional capitalist sense, that you buy things and sell things to make a profit and so on. But they were entrepreneurs, and their indigenous and original entrepreneurship really set the stage for what is now modern Guyana. The economy, the whole notion of the agricultural economy has its roots in the villages. The whole notion of government, right? What we call now what we now call local government was the basis of local and national government, all right? The education system. When those people came off the plantations, well, the first thing they did is they built the churches. That's well known. And next to the churches, they built schools, setting the stage for the education system that we know today. So in many regards, those who came out of enslavement were the pioneers of the political economy of Guyana. They made it possible for our brothers and sisters who came here, some forcibly, some of their own volition, came here as indentured laborers, came under harsh conditions, but not slave conditions. And so therefore, the act of emancipation on the part of Africans is very important to understanding the political sociology of this country. If you want to understand the political sociology of this country, you go there. So, and of course, we know that when you are fighting against entrenched systems, such as colonialism, they're not going to allow you to just do what you want. And so there was always a fight, a pushback against the economics. And Africans, when they were pushed out of their own economic environment, they then gravitated to the towns. And as you said, got into the public service and so forth. And it was in the public service that, again, they're playing important roles. The police force, the army that came later on, the teaching profession, the healthcare profession, the very running of the government, what we call the public service. They're playing central roles. And so therefore, in order to understand what we call the modern Guyanese political economy, one has to start there and then move out. You mentioned, and I'm going to comment on this and stop, you mentioned that early post-independence era of the PNC under Forbes Burnham, where the government embarked on a very ambitious and necessary social program. If you're coming out of 200 and odd years of slavery, another 150 years of colonialism, one of the first things you're doing, you're trying to transform a plantation into a nation. And that was the challenge of that early Burnham government. How do you transform a plantation? Because when the British left there, they left us an economy with sugar. We were just getting into bauxite, but that's it. What they call a monoculture economy. When you go to university and you do an economics 101, you're talking about a society that is able to produce for itself. And then the surplus that it produces, it trades, gets revenue to buy things that it cannot produce. And that's what we call a normal economy. Was not the economy that we inherited. So you're asking these post-colonial leaders to do another miracle. And that is to transform a plantation to nation. And where do they start? They start with the social framework, that is empowering the people. Education, healthcare, that's where the emphasis were. Small businesses. And, you know, many of us had problems with the manner of government. I mean, the way in which the post-colonial leaders manage power. But in terms of the content, nationalization, right? National service, free education, one could not argue with those content. And I don't think there was a contestation of those things. I mean, all the political parties in Guyana supported nationalization. They were fighting each other at the level of politics, but they supported nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy. And so therefore, African Guyanese workers were empowered in that early period. In what sense? In the sense that they labor in the public service, which was diminished during the colonial period. They labor now at dignity. The public servant was now somebody in those early years, right? Now, you made a very important point that they were not steered towards the business sector. But that itself is the logic of what the leaders were trying to do. They were trying to build a socialized economy, what we loosely call socialism, right? And socialism meant that you're putting emphasis in social development, right? Putting emphasis in equaling the labor and the dignity of people, and less emphasis on the individual. And entrepreneurship in a capitalist sense is the privileging of individualism. And so Africans also not coming out of that notion, that culture of individualism, right, did not really get into individualized entrepreneurship, but they continued communal entrepreneurship. They began mining fowl and chicken and pigs and so on. I grew up as a little boy. Everybody was rearing pigs and poultry and so on. So there was entrepreneurship, but it was not the capitalist type of entrepreneurship. It was the entrepreneurship that sought to build up the community, right? A community form of entrepreneurship that happened there. And I like to tell people, I came in today and I noticed you have the photographs there of the leaders, the past leaders. And I noticed Jainarayan Singh and J.P. Lachman Singh, who came over at Burnham in 1955, and Jainarayan Singh subsequently left. And I said, you know, I have to call Aubrey and to remind him that A.U.C. Kwayana wrote the battle song,
right?
The PPP. He was vice chairman. He was general secretary.
I think he wrote the one for the PPP as well.
And the WPA, right? But I'm telling you about his service to the PNC. He wrote the PNC song. He was the editor of New Nation. He was the vice chairman and later general secretary of the PNC. He organized the early PNC groups up and down this coast. And if you have Jaina Ryan Singh picture there, I want to tell you, I'll be better find a picture of UC Quine and put it there.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
But that period that you talk about was good for African Guyanese, because you had the African Guyanese political leadership led by Mr. Burnham and the PNC, and you had the cultural leadership led by Kwayana and Askre. And so that the political leadership could do the political work. Askre did the cultural work in terms of organizing people culturally, and the policy came from the political thing, and there was a merger. Many people do not know that the cooperative in Cooperative Republic was suggested to Mr. Burnham by Mr. Kwayana.
Interesting.
Yes, Mr. Kwayana gave our country the cooperative in our Cooperative Republic. All right, Mr. Kwayana was the head of the committee that organized and put in place the Co-op Bank. Right? Mr. Kwayana was in charge of land reform under the PNC. I am saying that African Guyanese benefited in that early period because there was the margin of the cultural and the political leadership. And I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. I know you're accustomed to longer programs, and just as refreshing conversation. We have a 1 hour limit, and we're almost there. So I want to ask you to move to the period from 1992 to 2015. In that period, Dr. Hinds, in fact, between 92 and 97, the public sector, that public service, predominantly populated by African Guyanese. Jobs were made redundant. The public sector shrunk by 20,000, upwards of 20,000 jobs. So in that 5 to 7 year period, you had more than 20,000 African Guyanese without employment. You had a reduction in the strength of the Guyana Defense Force, which at one time I think operated at somewhere around 1,300 members. So it meant that when you reduce the strength, you displaced African Guyanese. The Guyana National Service, which was still intact in 1992 in not as huge a format as it was in the earlier days, that was disbanded entirely. And then there was the Army Reserve Corps, the Guyana People's Militia, that was virtually dead. It was killed in that period. All these actions removed African Guyanese from active employment and the ability to earn, put food on the table for their children. What we had emerging was a sweetie tray, cigarette tray kind of operation on the streets. We abuse it now, we cuss it now, we say it's disorderly. But it was an absolute necessity at the time when it emerged, because it meant feeding people. It meant mothers feeding their children. It meant fathers being able to go in the gold fields or whatever and know that things are okay at home. So this period of time seemed to be a period of disempowerment of the African Guyanese. It was a twist of the colonial operation. It was like Animal Farm. You know, the humans left and the pigs took over. Not much changed, except who was in charge. So this is what the People's Progressive Party did to African Guyanese over the period of time. And now you have a situation where the People's Progressive Party, having done this to African Guyanese in the discipline services, for example, ensure that all the command centers around Guyana, the majority of them, are manned by East Indian Guyanese, and the predominant population of the police, being African Guyanese, is now being dominated by a few handpicked. So all this is happening now, and here is this gentleman, Jagdeo, saying Norton should encourage African Guyanese to go into business if he vex because they ain't getting work in the public sector. And in the ministries, you may have 2 African Guyanese as permanent secretaries. Tell us briefly what this kind of disempowerment is doing to the psyche and the well-being economical in the economical sense of the African Guyanese.
I'm so glad you have gone there. To answer that question, one has to look at motive. There are a lot of factors that are at play between 1992 and 2015 for the outcomes that you have mentioned there. One, there's always been in Guyana a feeling of anti-Black racism. Now, if these people are slaves, they are subhuman. It means that you have to fear them because they're not acting as human beings. They are going to kill you. They are going to rob you. They are going to rape you. And that notion of the African is universal, comes out of this dehumanizing experience, right? As they said in America, African people could not exist in a state of freedom. They're not full human beings. And so there is that notion that still runs through our our cultural thinking. Then there is the notion of structure. The Guyanese political and economic structure is based on the whole notion of ensuring that African people are kept in their place. So you have the culture, and then you have the structure. So the police force was created in 1840. You're coming out of enslavement. The police force is created to keep Africans in their place. So you spoke about the way in which they flooded the African lands when they were about to reap their crops, the way in which they were pushed out of entrepreneurship and agriculture and pushed into the public service. All of that is done through policy by the state. So there's a structural angle to the disempowerment of Africans. And this is brought in to independence, right? Now, the post-independence leaders are trying to build a nation and to try to fix this structural problems that we brought, the anti-Black nature of the police force, the anti-Black nature of the state. Just the other day, we found out the police are still calling Blacks Negroes. All those things are there. But if you are trying to build a nation of 6 races, you are sacrificing some things. And so the anti-Black structure of our society has remained. Now, the PPP comes to power. The PPP feels that the African-led party did them wrong, and they're going to use state power to take political revenge. So part of the PPP's motive is political revenge. Part of it has to do with the very state system and the very notion of the African. You know, we heard the president say, Black people came here for betterment, right?
Which means that. It's ridiculous.
But it comes from a thinking that they were savages in Africa.
Either that or from the mind of a lunatic.
But when he said that, he's expressing something that is abroad in sections of this society. They don't express it because they don't have the platform like he did. But he was expressing something that is part and parcel of our thinking about Black people. Here are these savages from Africa who came here and they went under slavery. Was good to them, right? Because back there they were savages, and to be a slave is better than to be a savage. That thinking, I think, resides in some section of the PPP's collective thought process. I'm not dealing with individuals. I don't know what happens in an individual mind. I don't know what is happening in the president, but what I do know is that there is a collective feeling that African people are inferior, and that when you merge that with the wanting to take revenge for what the PNC did, what Burnham did to Indian Guyanese, then the outcome is the PPP's policy, all right? And the PPP's policy of weakening the Black community. You can't chase them out of Guyana. You can't make them non-citizens. What you can do is use the power of the state to bring them into subjection. And that is what we are seeing by the PPP since 1992. What that has meant for the African Guyanese community is that you have new generations who are coming in devoid of history, devoid of context. So they see these things happening. They see the PPP coming into the communities and throwing crumbs at them. And they are impoverished, and they feel the natural thing to do is to take the crumbs. They don't have the historical context to realize taking that crumbs is itself acquiescing to what you said the slave masters did and the PPPs doing. So the African Guyanese community has been completely, well, not completely, has been severely weakened by the PPP, and they're taking advantage of a people whose reflexes are weakened. But at the same time, as you are weakening the community, you're also strengthening resolve, right? Because over time, people are beginning to say, but this is not normal. And so you have the acquiescing on the part of some African Guyanese. We have some choice names to them in the African Guyanese community that I don't want to desecrate your program with, right? But there is that, but there is also a resistance, a latent resistance to that kind of thing. So what you have in the African Guyanese community is a struggle that is going on now between the forces that are being led by the PPP to crush and dampen the African Guyanese to the point where he or she will have to crawl. And then there's the spirit of resistance that the rest of us, some of us African Guyanese, are putting up. And it at this particular point there is that intense struggle. And we saw it playing out here in the emancipation, where the PPP blatantly, maliciously, disrespectfully sought to derail the African Guyanese observances of emancipation.
As they have with the labor movement.
With the labor movement. And so therefore, this year emancipation was not so much celebration, it was protest and resistance. Right? Resistance against those who would want to turn a sacred moment into a blatantly, opportunistically political moment meant to weaken the African, and those of us who say, no, you're not going to do this, we're going to fight back. That's the point where we are in the African Guyanese community.
There's another deliberate disempowerment policy by the People's Progressive Party employed over that period. And this has to do with landed cooperatives. Cooperatives peopled by African Guyanese that held lands, whether it's for housing or agriculture, found themselves being either deregistered or disbanded in some other way. Cooperative credit unions found themselves in the same predicament. One of the oldest cooperatives in this country was Rosananti.
Yes.
That was deregistered by Manzoor Nadir, who was Minister of Labor, who's now Speaker of the National Assembly, who incidentally was the leader of the United Force, and who took indigenous people's votes and went over to the PPP without their leave, without their permission, and became a minister. So all these landed cooperatives, Mar Friends, Rosananti, and others, they came under the hammer of the People's Progressive Party because somehow they didn't qualify to have these lands. But on the back of all of this that we've discussed so far, and time is really running fast, Mr. Irfan Ali, who occupies the office of the president, and who occupies that office under circumstances of disputed election results. They claim to have 51% of the votes. Many of us, including me, I don't agree with them. Given the population demographics, it appears to me that the African Guyanese did not give Irfan Ali and the People's Progressive Party a mandate to do anything. But Mr. Ali has taken it upon himself to speak for the African Guyanese community on the international stage about reparation. Mr. Ali, in my view, does not have the political mandate to speak for African Guyanese anywhere, and in my humble view, does not have the moral authority to speak to the subject of reparations anywhere on behalf of African Guyanese. What are your views, Dr.
I
Hinds?
completely agree with you. I mean, he's the president of the country. He can speak for the country. And insofar as he's speaking on reparations, he should be talking about this government, the post-emancipation government, giving reparations to Africans. We are saying there are two types of reparations that Africans are entitled to. Reparations for what happened before 1838, that is during the period of enslavement, and reparations for what happened after 1838. You led us off in the atrocities committed against African Guyanese people in the post-emancipation state, of which this state is a successor state. Now, when at the time of emancipation, the colonial state inherited both the liabilities and the assets of the slave state. At independence, the post-independent state inherited the liabilities and the assets of the colonial state. And so during that period, African people, and I dare say indigenous peoples and East Indian and Portuguese, have their claim for reparations from the post-emancipation state. But I'm saying African people, because of what they went through prior, and they brought the scars of bondage, this state owes reparations to African Guyanese, and like I did say, other ethnic groups. So if Ali's talking about reparations, he should be sitting down with African Guyanese leaders and say, how can this post-colonial state, this state that now has more money than it has ever had before, how can we use those resources to heal some of the wounds, to repair, because that's what reparations is, to repair the African Guyanese condition. That's what you should be talking about. You mentioned during your introduction the notion of self-determination. It is still a cardinal notion for groups around the world. African Guyanese, like other ethnic groups, have the right to self-determination. We determine our ethnic notion and motion, not some leader of a president of the country, in any case, whose position is questionable, right? And so the right for African Guyanese to determine from a cultural and historical position what they want is a right that we must have, and we are demanding, and we are saying, no, Ali, you do not speak for us. They like to say, well, David Hinds think he's speaking, and Vincent Alexander, who they think they speak for African people. Let me say, no, I do speak for African people, and I earned it. They sent me to school, they took care of me, and they made sure that I was able to rise above where my grandparents and parents were. And they instilled in me, and Vincent and Eric and all the rest of us, they instilled in us the old notion that you come back to the community and serve your community. So yes, we are entitled to be leaders, and we do speak for Africans.
I want to point to a specific case of the violation of the right to self-determination of the African Guyanese. One example, and this is the denial of Itpadaji, of that subvention that was given by the government of Guyana. It started, I believe, under President Granger in the decade of the African people. Now, when a budget is passed, it becomes an act of parliament. It is presented as a bill, it is debated, it is approved, it becomes law. That instrument is an instrument of law. Bharat Jagdeo decided that he had the power to override that law, that decision of parliament, the elected officials of the people of this country, including African representation, and to override the signature on that document by the president of the land, and to say, we're not giving this money to this organization anymore. That is not just a violation of the law, that relates to budgetary
Yeah.
allocations. It is a deliberate, unconscionable violation of the right to self-determination of the African Guyanese. And that right, the specific right to that money, comes or has its birth in the United Nations when they identified the decade of the African people across the world. Tell us briefly what your view is on Mr. Jagdeo's actions in that regard, and then tell us if that alone does not disqualify the People's Progressive Party from speaking for the African Guyanese, particularly
Yes.
on reparations.
Yes, it disqualifies them. Marvin, under Mr. Burnham, there was subvention to the national liberation struggle in Africa.
In Africa, yes. $50,000.
In our budget.
Yes.
When Mr. Granger came in and he gave that small subvention to it, he was continuing in that tradition.
Yes.
But you know what Mr. Granger also did? He gave $500,000 to Ravi Dev and them for Indian Arrival Day.
Yes.
They were forced and pressured by the PPP to give back the money or to say they don't want it, but Mr. Granger offered them. So he was offering a subvention to Africans in the international decade as mandated by the United Nations. And the United Nations said it is the states who must deal with the racial discrimination that are still present in our societies. That's what the United Nations said. And so Mr. Granger was acting in that regard. All right. And like I said, he not only gave a subvention to Ipadaji or to the decade, he gave a subvention to Roar and G, I think they call themselves Ravi Dev and them. All right. And so forth. And that they took that subvention away is a slap, more than a slap in the face of African Guyanese. You're saying to us, African Guyanese, that the government coffers is not open to you. The government coffers are not open to you. We're going to use this money to do everything else, but to help the African Guyanese community reach the mandate of the decade of independence, the decade of African people. And so therefore, it has disqualified them totally from having any say on behalf of African Guyanese. And we are not playing with that. We are socializing our people to understand that what the PPP is systematically doing is writing us out of the political economy of this country, writing us out of the commanding heights of this economy, African Guyanese people. And so therefore, we're at this point where we are saying that the PPP has no moral authority. The president has no moral authority to speak on our behalf. And we are ensuring that we put that in practice. We're not complaining. If they don't want to give the subvention, the strategy is not going to close down. We're going to continue to do the work. But your point is well taken, that they are disqualified from speaking or acting on behalf of African Guyanese.
Where do we go as a country? Emancipation means different things to different people. The African slaves, when they were said to be free, were really not free initially. There were two periods, amelioration and
the apprenticeship
period. And then in that period, the former slave owners were rewarded.
They were given reparations.
They were given reparations for their losses, as they put it, loss of property.
Loss of property.
Where does that put us as a nation in terms of what emancipation means for Guyana vis-a-vis what emancipation means for the African Guyanese? And that I imagine would be my last question.
Yeah, and I think that is always the question that we have to grapple with as a country, as a nation. I think African Guyanese have to come to the consciousness of their place in Guyana. I think they're perhaps the group with the lowest sense of consciousness of the place. You know, the irony is that African Guyanese tend to be more patriotic to Guyana than patriotic to the African Guyanese identity.
Yes.
And it's a strength, but it's also a weakness, right? And so that we feel that, especially this new generation of African Guyanese, that we have to work on them to come to a consciousness of their place as an ethnic group in this society. So that's one level of work, and we are doing that kind of work every day. It's slow work, but it's work that is ongoing. Secondly, I think Guyana, as a country, has to rediscover its reason for being. Independence did not mean a government with 51% of the vote behaving as though it has 100% of the vote. Independence never meant that. Independence never meant that groups such as Amerindian native, or native people, or African people, because they did not vote for a government, that they should be subjected to the kind of hammering from that government. Independent doesn't mean that. It means, therefore, that we've got to redefine our independence. And we have to do that with power in our hands. And that is why, you know, Kwame Nkrumah says, seek ye thy political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you. Karl Marx says, seek ye thy economic kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto. Both are true. And both are true in Guyana right now.
Join together.
Join together. And so, therefore, I think the coming elections is crucial. It's not just an election about good over evil, as some people are putting it. I don't buy that. It's really an election about what are we going to do about our country going forward with the kind of economic wealth that we are having. This election is about that. It's about how we distribute that wealth. It's about how we use that wealth to lift those groups that were left behind through the circumstances of our history. And so, therefore, state power becomes very important. This election will have to be won by the forces who are committed to democratizing our nation, not in terms of European democracy
or numbers,
but in terms of the well-being and the dignity of our people. Marvin, you talk about the cigarette people and so on and thing. Those of us who don't have to do it
would never appreciate.
Never appreciate. And, you know, it hurts me when I walk along the streets in the hot sun and see little children hawking a bottle of water in that hot sun. And to say that the state doesn't see that and doesn't feel it needs to transform that. And that is what I think a new government of people with conscience, leaders who are prepared to think about that little child, to think about that old lady who comes out there every afternoon selling or planting chip and so on, and sitting there and not knowing if she's going to take home $1,000 at the end of the afternoon. You know, we need a government that think about that, and is a government that is governed by that. So our way forward has to be, in the first instance, ensuring that we have a free environment for fair elections, and then use the elections as a means of putting people to manage the state in the first instance, people who are committed to the people of this country, and that we move from a one-party winner-take-all notion of state power to one in which each group in this society, whether it's an ethnic group, a social group, gender, that all groups in the society are able to live in security and peace. And I think it's possible.
Yes, many Guyanese believe that it's possible. I think the problem that we have is that there's a greed with which we're plagued, where a class is being created, an elite class, a very small elite class. And that class is creating a middleman sort of class, where contracts are given and there's a middleman contractor who does nothing but then he goes out there and subcontracts to others.
Yeah.
And so that there's wealth in a small space and poverty in a very larger space, very much larger space. And I would close with a quote from Aristotle, who said that poverty is the parent of revolution and crime.
There you go.
Dr. Hinds, thank you very much for joining me on Nation Watch today. And I'm sure our viewers have a lot to think about as we approach general and regional elections. Whenever they come, we must be ready. And no matter how many of our rights are violated, no matter how often our rights are violated, we have a very powerful instrument at our disposal. It's an X marked with a pen at the right place on a ballot paper when those elections come. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on Nation Watch today. Dr. Hinds, thank you for being here. And that's all we have time for today on Nation Watch. Until we meet again next Sunday,